Hey, hi. In this video, we will see how to access private Azure function or Azure function enabled with private VNet endpoint with using API management services. So here I'm going to show you a lab session where we're going to create a Azure VNet. In that Azure VNet, we have subnets are being created. We're going to host the or basically enable the Azure private endpoints for Azure functions. In this case, I'm using Python functions of Azure Function Apps. Now we will see that how does this service can be made to access the another services in the same Azure VNet enabled with the VNet private endpoint, that is storage account. Now we will create an API management services which is integrated in this virtual network, so that whenever we make an API call through the API management services pointing to this particular Azure Function App, which is enabled with the private endpoint, now talks to the another services that is sitting in the same VNet and being accessible over the VNet private endpoint. So basically, this is an end-to-end scenario where we're gonna show you like how does this lab setup can be done, or basically this is a practical scenario where at an enterprise service level this can be enabled. So here we will see like how this setup can be enabled, so that a developer tries to access the API, and the API is doing an activity that is storing a message into the storage queue with using the Azure Function App, and the Function App being sitting in the VNet over the VNet private endpoint. So let's see how to do this particular configurations in the Azure, and then finally we're going to see the demo of this particular setup. So here I have already did set the configurations to save the time. I'm going to quickly walk you through the configurations being set, and then we do see a quick demo as well. So here I have the resource group called something cost optimizations. So in this one I created a virtual network that is a default virtual network with this particular IP address. Then we did create a these many subnets. I'm going to show you what are these is for. So here is the the we have the here is where we have the three subnets. I'm going to tell you what are these subnets are being doing and how does these delegations happen automatically. So we created a test subnet, and we use this test subnet to enable the private endpoint for function app and for the Azure storage account, pointing to the Azure storage queue basically. And then we used default subnet, and this default subnet is been used to enable the VNet integration for APIM. We're going to show you how to do that. Then we also create a VNet integration for function app, so that the function app can talk to the Azure storage queue, which is sitting in the same VNet actually. So this is the setup here, and then we have also created a security group here. The security group that we have created here is something like this. It is very plain subs, the security group, our network security group. It is enabled with the very default the network routing inbound and outbound rules. And that's all about the virtual network configurations for now. Let's go to the component by component. So as we have seen in the previous diagram, so there we have seen that how did we create a function app, and then how did we enable the private endpoint. So that is something I'm going to cover up first, and then we come back to the API management. So here I have created a function app that is using the flex consumption, because the Azure function app with the pricing tier called flex consumption has the capability to make it virtual networking. So if you see here, so we used this plan, that is flex consumption, right? So it has the virtual networking capabilities, whereas if you go for a consumption, that does not has it. Okay, so that's the reason we used it flex consumption, whereas again the other options are also can be explored in your size. But remember that there should be a virtual networking should be enabled. So we have that flavor of function app here. So, and in this function app, I have deployed an example function called Python function, and this is an HTTP trigger function. Okay, so if you want to understand how to deploy a function in the Azure function app with using the GitHub Actions, you can watch my previous video where I have explained the concept around this one. So, but in this context, we are less looking at this context. I assume that you have the your source code ready. So in this case, the source code is nothing but a logic that will enable the function app to store a message into the storage queue, right? So that logic is already been written. I'm going to show you the code as well at a high level. So this is my function app function, that is Python function and HTTP trigger. Now I need to make this, the function accessible within the VNet. That is nothing but enabling the private endpoints. To enable the private endpoint, we go to the settings, that is go to the networking here. So in the networking, you see that I have enabled the inbound traffic and there is an outbound traffic. Let me give you a little bit insight about inbound, the traffic. Inbound traffic talks about, if somebody wants to access the function apps functions, that is inbound traffic. If function app itself wants to talk to the another service within the VNet, that is outbound traffic. So the concept are slightly different but has its own meaning. So we want to invoke the function app with using the APIM. That is nothing but inbound traffic. So for that case, what we have done is we have enabled, the inbound traffic. So how did I enable inbound traffic? That is, if I go to the virtual network here and there is there is like an inbound traffic. So here we enable the basically we enable the inbound access. So if I show you here, so right now I am disabling the access, in the sense I am disabling the the complete access from the internet. If you see here, right, and we are completely blocking the inbound access from the internet completely. Okay. So then how does it access? And that is where we have enabled the private endpoint. That is something I'm going to show you here. So if you go to the same setting here, so there is a private endpoint being enabled. So we have disabled the network access, that is public network access, nothing but somebody wants to talk from the internet, it is disabled. We have enabled the private endpoint. So I'm going to show you how did we enable the private endpoint. So when you create a function app itself, you can enable the private endpoint or you can enable it later as well. So how did we enable is something like this. So if you go to the something, if you click on this one, so this is what the private endpoint configuration looks like. So hope that you understand this one. That is nothing but you just have to come to that particular configuration, choose the virtual network and subnet. Okay, and then that's it. So at the end of the day, at the end of the time, at the end of creation of the particular private endpoint, the private endpoint gets created. So we created two things here. We disabled the public network access and we enable the private endpoint, and the inbound address is dynamic. So private endpoint is created here. And then at the outbound traffic, so as I said, so for outbound traffic, if I can explain this concept with you, the same diagram again. So here you see the diagram. If I come back to the same diagram again, so right now by enabling the VNet endpoint, the APIM, which is again another services, can make an inbound call to the Azure function, right? But again, function app need to talk to the another service, that is storage queue. You need a VNet integration. So basically there are two configuration has to be enabled for private transaction, that is inbound and outbound. So that is the reason we are enabling the VNet integration as well for the function app. Okay, so here you see that in the outbound traffic configurations, here is the virtual network integration, you see. So that is something we have enabled it here. So when you enable a virtual network, we have to select the virtual network name, and it will ask a dedicated subnet. Okay, remember that it will ask a dedicated subnet of almost /24 IP address or available of 20, 251 IP address, something like that. And the subnet, this is the subnet I have selected for the site. Okay, this is the plan. So basically, when you enable the VNet integration, so you have to point it to that configurations. So that is what the configuration we have done in the function app. Okay, so this is the something configuration we did it on a function app and the functions, and our everything is ready. Now let me go to our destination. That is nothing but the function app needs to talk to the Azure storage queue. So for that case, I have a storage account. In this storage account, we have created a queue. So this is what the queue looks like. So this queue name is test queue, right? And one more thing which we did is we did a private endpoint enablement on that queue services, something like this. So if you go to the security and networking, and here is where we have created a private endpoint for queue services. So in the firewall and virtual network, the configuration should be disabled. This is something that you can do it even when you create a storage account for the first time, either through the portal or through the Terraform as well. So in the private endpoint, what we did is, so here is where we did it like something, if you click on a private endpoint, you're going to choose the resource group, to give the name of the private endpoint, something like this, right? And then go to the next one. So in the next resource, so it is going to choose the resources. Since we have the queue is already been enabled, so you don't need to do it again. So this is how we enable it, and then go to the networking. In the networking, you're going to choose the subnet. Yeah, consider that we're going to choose the test subnet. That's where even the function of VNet endpoint is sitting. And the private IP configuration, let it be dynamic. Rest all configuration, let's just keep it default. Keep it default DNS tags, and review and create. So once you review is complete, so you're going to click on a create. It will create a private endpoint for your queue services. So remember that this is private endpoint for queue services. That is something that you can recognize that by going to the DNS configuration. So here is the queue.core. The windows.net, which is nothing but private endpoint for storage account queue services. Now with that said, we have now function app, and we have now queue services sitting in the virtual network and enabled with the private endpoint for queue services, and then VNet integration for function app as extra. Now let me go to the our main service. So basically, when you integrate a Azure Function App over the VNet endpoint, so you cannot access its endpoint as an API from the internet. That is becomes encapsulated within the virtual network. So for that case, we need to create a API management service, which is recommended for the API integrations purpose or API management purpose. So here I created an API management services, and the tier is of version 2, that is standard version. So remember that I have used standard version 2. So when I created this particular API management services, I have created the further configuration. That is something I'm going to explain it here. So once the API management services have been created, you're going to go to the APIs. In the APIs, so you cannot use, so here you cannot use the function app because, you have enabled the function app with the private endpoint. So for that case, you have to go to the HTTP. So click on a HTTP because our function app is accessible over the HTTP. So I'm going to open this particular function app in the side by tab. So don't get confused here. So I am switching over the tabs, and tabs have opened the respective service pages. So if we go to this one and click on this one, and then we're going to go to the the get URL, right? So I just keeping this page open in the side tab so that I can reference the references of the URLs. So I will switch over back to the the test API management services, where we are configuring the HTTP API. So here you can give some display name, something like this, web service URL. So your web service URL is nothing but this one. So if you go to this one, so this is my web service URL. All right. So I'm going to copy that and put it here. Okay, then URL suffix. URL suffix is nothing but something /. Okay, so that is something you can give it as something like a function. Okay, so basically that is something gets added here. You can give it as something like a dummy one. Okay, and click on a create. So once you click on a create, so it will create the configuration something like this. So once you create the API, its configuration looks like this. But within that, you have to add the operation as well. To add the operation, you're going to click on add operation here and say like give the name. So here, what do you want to call to that API, right? So that is something you can give it as like display name, something like call your func something, nothing but call your function within the function app, something like that you can give it. And then in the URL, you're gonna give the methods of URL and of your function, that is get post, something like that, based on what you have configured in a function app. So here you're gonna give the resource. So what is our resource? That is something that you're gonna see it here. So that is after /API. After this, whatever it comes, right? So that is nothing but whatever I have selected, right? That is API / and function, then question mark. So in between, whatever comes in, that is your resource of your function. So you're gonna copy that and paste it here, and that's it. And click on a save. So which will configure the the uh, operation, that is API operation. So in this case, post API operation. So it would look like this. All right. So once this has been done, we have to set the one more thing, that is basically inbound processing policy. So I'm going to open this one. So this is how basically it looks like. So we, here is something that I'll discard it. So we have added the policies. Okay. So that basically, we have added the inbound policies. That is something I'm going to show you. So how to add that policy is something that right now we have to show you something here. So to inbound processing, basically, when you call an API with using the API management services, we're going to provide the headers, bodies, and then the authentication mechanism, right? So that would be configured here, right? So that is something, we're going to configure it here basically. Um, so that is how to configure that. That is something I'm going to show you right now. So to enable the inbound processing policy, that is, you see that we have added the policies names like base, checker head, set query parameters, something that, you can do something like this. So for this one, I have a policy helper file, which I'm going to share this file in the video's description. You can copy there from there and just copy paste it. So before you copy paste this particular, the policy document, you have to do a couple of things. One is, you go to the named values. So named values is nothing but, this is nothing but parameter that you can keep it on a API management services. So here I created a two parameter called function key. That is nothing but, our function key. That is, if you go to the here, you're going to get the function key that is after code. So whatever the value that you see from the after code, that value has been put in that particular named value, that is function key. Similarly, for the subscription key, so that is something you can find it from here. Go to the subscription. So here is a subscription key that you can get it, and then add it in the named values. So I have added the two named values like this. And after that, you're gonna go back to the same API here, and then so then go to that particular operation, that is post operation for call Python function, and then here is the something like button, and after that, so there is give a space here, and then copy paste the whatever content I have given in the video's descriptions link. That is nothing but copy from policy help.txt file. Okay, and exactly you have to do it, right? And then just do a copy paste, click on a save. That's it. So once you do this, in my case I have already done it, so I'm going to discard it now. Save it. With this setup, you have done the API configurations. There is one thing I have to tell you before we invoke this our function app with using the APIs. That is something, if you go to the network settings here, that is something here in the security, not security, I think so. We can find that in the integration. So let me open that integrations. So now we try to integrate with the VNet, right? So here we are not enabling the endpoint. Remember that we are just integrating into the virtual network. So there is a two different, right? And that's the reason you see that we have inbound is public access enabled, because I want this API to be accessed from the so I want this API to be accessible from the internet. So we have enabled the public access, you see that, and no private endpoint is enabled. All right, but we have enabled the VNet integration. What is the VNet integration talks about? VNet integration is nothing but you are actually making the service to sit in the virtual network so that it can talk to the services that is available in the virtual network. So that is only difference between there. So we have enabled the VNet integration for this particular services. Let me refresh it here. I will show you how did we do that, the VNet integration. So VNet integration is available somewhere here. So if you go to this one, so you can click on edit here. So in the VNet configuration, so we have enabled the outbound feature, that is enable the VNet integration, selected the virtual network, and we created a dedicated subnet for this one. That is the reason I have showed you when we talked about virtual network configuration. So we created a dedicated subnet for APIM, that is API management service, and that is where it creates a, and that subnet has to have the delegations to the one service that is called as so if you go to subnets, so this subnet is been delegated with the, yeah, so let me go back to this one. So this subnet, that is nothing but default subnet, is delegated to the Microsoft.web.server form. So remember, this is a mandatory configuration. So you create a dedicated subnet, delegate it to this Microsoft.web.web/server forms, and then use that subnet, when you enable the VNet integration on the API management. So with that, you are done basically. So all configurations of the APIM is done. Now to test this particular API, what do? Is you go back to the APIs page and click on APIs. Then again here you can get the your API. So here is your the endpoint. So if you call it here, this is our endpoint. Okay, let me click on this one. So now this is becomes our server service URL, nothing but our API URL, right? So now let me go back to the my one piece of code which I have created in a Python code. So I have written a file called test APIM .py, which is calls our function of API. So this is very simple Python code which will call that, which is basically mimics how you need to integrate in your applications. So it has the import of request. So what is our base URL? So our base URL is nothing but test AMI Azure API .NET. That is nothing but you can get it from here. So that is nothing but I will discard this one, so not needed. We go to the ORU. In the ORU we get this particular URL, that is nothing but gateway URL. So you need to copy that, right? And that is where I have kept it here. And then API path. So what is our API path? So that API path is nothing but that is something we have enabled when we created the API. So that is something you can get it from here. Go to the your API, right? And in this one, so if you click on this, right, click on this one. So that is nothing but you see that if you click on this one, here is where you see that that is Python function. Okay, so that is something we are adding here. Nothing but our suffix, that is APIM base URL suffix, that is Python, which is something I have given when you created that API resource. And then Python function is nothing but our original function in the Azure Function App. Okay, and then this is where our subscription key. So the subscription key is nothing but your named values that you created when you enable the policies on the your API, right? That is subscription key, right? So here you don't need a function app keys because you are using the API management services subscription key. And the rest all is very straightforward. So here is my JSON data, that is nothing but my parameter that I pass to invoke my function of function. And then it has this header syntax that you can copy paste it as it is. It has the content type, it has that, you need to follow these syntax. Okay, you need to follow these key and values pointing to the our subscription key. And rest all is we are just invoking the post method. So now what I'm doing is I am sending a message to the my queue services, right? So if I go back to the our diagram, right? So now we are actually doing the demo. That is, I am being a developer, I am calling that API with using the API management services API, and which is internally talks to the queue services and stores the messages. Okay, so before I do that, I'm going to show you the simple code quickly. So this is the code that we have written, which will store the message into the storage queue. So it uses the identity and the storage queue. So what did I do is basically, if I tell you, so we have enabled the the private endpoint. Basically, we have enabled the private endpoint, and then um, we have enabled the um, basically identity. So if you go to the identity, so we created a managed identity and assigned the storage queue contributor role on the storage account where the queue is sitting. This is about providing access to the function app so that it can store the queue into the storage queue. This is something extra part, right? Apart from the VNet configuration, this also need to be there in place. And with that set, this is the code which is actually written a logic which will store the message into the storage queue. That's it. So I'm not going to walk you through this code, but it is very simple. We are using the two modules, that is Python SDK modules for storage queue and identity. That's it, right? Identity is to authenticate with using the managed identity, and storage, the FDK, SDK is for talking to the storage account queue over the Python SDK. So that is the function is been deployed in that function app. Now we are calling that. Okay, so let me say this is something like this, right? So when I call this file, nothing but I'm executing this script. Executing a script is nothing but invoking our API, or basically our invoking our APIs under API management services. To do that, I'm just running this particular file, that is test APIM service, okay, which contains my base rule and then this one. So likewise, here you go. So it has got a response saying like message sent. So how does that response is been sent by function? That is something, if you see here. So here is the here is the response. Message sent successfully, and status code is 200. That is exactly I'm getting here, and which means that my function is responding and it is doing the job, being in the VNet integrated or being enabled within the private access, right? So I can do that multiple times. So basically it keeps storing the same messages. Okay. So all right. So with that being shown everything from scratch to end. So with that note, I have shown you the things need to be shown in this video. Finally, kind request, please do subscribe my channel. That would really encourage me a lot. With that note, thank you. Thanks a lot and see you in the next video.